Alright, so we're back. Talking today again about the Great Depression. Talk about Hoover's response to the Depression, which was little if anything, versus Franklin Roosevelt's very aggressive response to it, and ultimately successful response to it. Talk about such issues as the Bonus March, look at Franklin D. Roosevelt, look at the New Deal, Glass-Steagall Act, National Recovery Administration, Agricultural Adjustment Act, Civilian Conservation Corps, Senator Huey Long, the Townsend Plan, Social Security Act, Wagner Act, the Works Progress Administration, the Rural Electrification Act, and the Fair Labor Standards Act. Okay. Questions on that? Okay. Well, part of what's happening during the Great Depression is basically Hoover has this very conservative mindset that basically he shouldn't do anything about the economy. Basically, the free market should fix itself. Which is asking a lot when you literally have people starving in the streets. The Great Depression is not caused by a lack of people willing to work. The people are not poor in this country because they don't want to work. That has never been the case. What's happening here is basically the economy has disintegrated. The entire financial system is basically melted down. And Hoover's expecting that the economy will piece itself back together. But, I'd say you can look at economic factors and say, yes, maybe eventually it might recover. 20 years. See what happens in some communities when factories leave or something like that. See that they never recover. So no matter what they try to do, what kind of forces are at work, that they just don't recover. See this, for example, with the railroad. When the railroad didn't come through some towns, this community disappeared in a few years. El Dorado, for example, is a city of about 35,000 people, about the size of Hot Springs. It's an industrial town, but a couple of factories closed down, a couple of businesses closed down. Population now about half that. That's been that way for the last, it's been a steady decline for the last 50 years. Look at some of those cities in Michigan. The auto industry built those big cities in Detroit, then in Michigan like Detroit. But when big automakers like Ford and General Motors decided to pull out and build factories elsewhere, tens of thousands of people were put out of work. Not because they weren't willing to work. There was nothing else to do in Detroit. All those businesses that supported those factories went down with it. So because those large factory jobs left, nothing replaced them, that city never recovered. So it's part of when you are in elected office, in that kind of position, you are responsible for everybody, not just the people who elected you. All the people. And you don't take care of all the people. You don't do something to make their lives easier, at least not make it any worse. Simple fact of politics and human existence and human history is things are going to get very bad for that community. That's your job when you're in elected office. You're there to make the hard decisions. And what happens is, because Hoover is refusing to do anything, the economy is getting worse, people are desperate, and Hoover is ended up alienating some of the most ardent supporters. See, Hoover comes into office as his reputation as great humanitarian, man who organized food relief efforts after World War I in Europe, organized the food supply efforts during the war at home. But another thing about this, Hoover never held an elected office before becoming president. He'd been Secretary of Commerce. He had been actually worked in the Wilson administration, the Harding administration, and the Coolidge administration, but never held an elected office before. His expertise, he had been a businessman before, an engineer, but a for-profit business is very different from a non-profit government. You see, the purpose of government is not to make a profit. That's what private industry does. The purpose of government is to provide certain services. It's two very different outcomes. On top of this, you have the increasing problems of race relations. And start seeing the emergence of what came to be called the Southern strategy in the Republican Party. So this, coupled with economic forces in the country, pointed to a complete realignment of American politics. And say, since Reconstruction, the South had remained overwhelmingly Democratic, in spite of crushing Republican victories nationwide in the 1920s. And see, the thing is about the South, they called the Solid South, was entirely reliably Democratic, no matter what. Always voting Democratic by heavy majorities in the presidential column. Always Democratic at the congressional and the state level. The thing is, you look at a lot of these Democrats in the South, is if they lived in any other part of the country, they'd be Republicans. Now, the Democratic Party is not monolithic. It's not just simply people, one particular mindset. Because it's the only viable political organization in the South. All these different organizations, all these competing interests in all these different states across the South, they are vying for control of the Democratic Party. So you have these extreme liberals, you have extreme conservatives, and everybody in between. And the fact that you have so many these conservative Democrats would have been conservative Republicans in other parts of the country. If they lived in other parts of the country, that had frustrated Republican leaders for years. So they're trying to change this. So what happens is, 1928, the Republican National Convention, accusations of corruption erupted from within the Southern delegation. Senator George Norris had been a prominent Midwestern Republican, had been investigating charges of Southern Republican leaders selling federal offices. Now, the only reason in some of these states why a Republican Party even exists is because federal patronage. If you're a Southern lawyer, you have a lot better chance of being a federal judge or being a federal U.S. attorney if you're a Republican and Republicans in the White House. This time period between Reconstruction and 1932, it's almost always a Republican president. Very few exceptions. Well, anyways, reports that some of these Southern Republican leaders are selling federal offices, basically. They'll give you that Postmaster General job, they'll give you that U.S. Attorney job, if and a little bit of cash. Well, these reports boiled over to conventional rumor circulated that Hoover supporters were trying to buy off the Southern delegates. Remember, they didn't have the primary system in place like they do now. They had a few sub-primaries, but not a lot. They didn't have people running from one end of the country to the other. Basically, the nomination was decided at the convention. They called in those days a brokered convention. Well, no evidence existed that Hoover or his supporters attempted any such thing, but the charges humiliated Hoover, and he gave in a long-sought attempt to change Southern Republican leadership. Now, all this is blowing off into the larger Republican campaign in 1928. Remember who's running? Al Smith, the Catholic. Republicans are doing everything they can to demonize Roman Catholics. So the fact they're going to try to demonize a lot of other groups is not much of a stretch. It's a true fact. But you have to remember the 1920s, the politics of the South is the politics of race. The South, by and large, is a society that frowns on any kind of social change. They don't like people who are off the boat, by and large, say about Southerners. And conservatives have always used racial fears to stay in power in the South. So race baiting, opposition to civil rights, it was always the conservative, always those opposed to change. So, by the 1920s, the Southern Republican Party divided into two camps. One called the Black and Tan faction, and one called the Blue White faction. So they actually called themselves. The Black and Tan faction favored civil rights. They want the federal government to do more to protect civil rights. They want anti-lynching bills, federal protection of civil rights. But the conservatives who dominated the Republican Party in the 1920s would do nothing.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, favored civil rights. Yeah. And lily white Republicans strongly oppose civil rights. Now, essentially, they're doing that as a means to an end. It is by opposing civil rights, they're trying to attract those conservative whites from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party at the expense of the traditional African American voters who, up to this point, still largely favored Republicans when they could vote in the South. It is the little white faction. The deep conservative faction of the Republican Party is they're going to abandon civil rights fully and completely in order to get Southern and white conservatives in the party. Well, the Black and Tan leadership had the dominated Southern Republican Party, included many African Americans. In fact, it's pretty much the only area where African Americans in the South could have any kind of political voice in some cases. But the charges of corruption have been leveled at them by the lily white faction. Well, Hoover agreed to the need to attract white leadership to the Republican Party, broaden party appeal to the South, but this meant they would have to basically give in to the reports that the Black and Tans are corrupt, get rid of them, and replace them with the white faction. Now, Hoover hoped that a competitive two-party system in the long run would solve the South's race problems. The parties would have to compete for minority support. But, for example, in 1928, only 5% of African Americans in the state of Virginia could even vote. That's one state where they had more minorities being able to vote than usual. But what ends up happening is the removal of the Black and Tan faction in the South, favored lily white faction, angered the rest of black Republicans. But to placate Southern conservatives even further, Hoover stayed silent on many civil rights issues, enraging African Americans. Remember, the Ku Klux Klan is still very active in some corners in the South. 1928. But even then, you still have those who sympathize with the ideas of the Ku Klux Klan. Still a lot of assaults, lynchings, houses being burned to the ground, people being murdered, and nothing being done about it. African Americans are demanding the federal government do something, anything, anti-lynching laws, federal civil rights protection, something. Hoover does absolutely nothing. Well, in 1930, Hoover nominates Judge John J. Parker of North Carolina to the U.S. Supreme Court. Parker was a part of the Lily White Republican faction. Now, Parker had narrowly lost statewide races previously in the 1920s because of Democratic race baiting. But essentially what Parker had done in these gubernatorial races in the 1920s was he tried to race bait just as much as his conservative Democratic opponent was. So NAACP leaders came forward, uncovering some of Parker's racist remarks, and solidified the NAACP's belief that Hoover was trying to force African Americans out of the Republican Party. Well, the incident ended up dooming Parker's nomination, and the African American support for Hoover in the Republican Party collapsed. Well, you still have a fair number of African Americans still voting for Republicans in the South up into the 1960s. But basically, it's the beginning to end of African American support for the Republican Party. Essentially, the Republican Party proclaimed itself to be the party of Lincoln and favored civil rights up to this point, basically casting African Americans aside, abandoning them. So, African Americans left. So, you're going to have all that heading into the election you're going into 1932. For the 1932 election, Roosevelt's choice of Texas Congressman John Nance Garner, a lot of African Americans would dread. They feared Roosevelt be dependent on white Southerners for support. Now, in the meantime, the Depression is worsening. Now, the government attempted to stimulate the economy and raise revenue for the faltering Treasury by raising tariffs. Basically, they're trying to raise revenue by raising taxes on products coming into the country or to try to collect enough money to help pay the bills. There's the thing, Britain was trying this and having some success with it, but Britain had a very different economy than the United States. The problems are very different. What you have to understand about economics is what the answers that may solve one recession could end up creating the next. And what solves a recession in one country could make it even worse in another. So, we get to the 1930 and can be called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. First, one of the most disastrous ideas in American history. What the Hawley-Smoot Tariff does is it raised tariffs to an all-time high on 70 farm products and 900 manufactured items. Well, 1,000 economists and economics professors across the country took a look at this bill and said, this is going to be a disaster. It's going to make the Depression worse. They petitioned Hoover, begging him to veto the bill, warning him of dire consequences if this tariff goes through. What ends up happening is Hoover signs the tariff into law, and the result is just what the economists predicted. It choked off what little trade remained. See, foreign trade is the one part of the economy that still had some kind of life left to it. And the Hawley-Smoot Tariff destroys it. So, the nation sinks further to depression. 1931, Deficit rises to $1 billion annually. Unemployment hits 16% nationwide. And it's going to get to 25% by 1932. Public shock to learn that J.P. Morgan has 19 partners in J.P. Morgan Bank. Some of the richest men in the country paid no income taxes in 1930, 31, or 32. Congress attempted to cut taxes and added a few public works projects to employ idle men. 1930, the Democrats had regained control of Congress because of the Hoover's poor response to the Depression. And the idea increasingly was you have all these men who are unemployed, put them to work doing something for the country, building and modernizing infrastructure. That is, all the country have dirt roads to be paved with concrete. You have schools that need repair. In some communities, they need to build a school, or hydroelectric dams to control flooding, provide electricity for some areas. Things that just weren't being done. But you have all these men out of work. They need the work. They can do the job. They need money. Why not put them to work? So the Boulder Dam project was commissioned in 1932. Later renamed Hoover Dam. It's the Colorado River on the Arizona-Nevada border. But basically, that's just one project out of many need to be done. A couple thousand men were put together to help build this dam, but there are millions more unemployed in 1931-32. In 1932, Hoover proposed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, try to give direct aid to corporations, basically to help corporations restructure their finances. Basically, it's going to loan money to foundering financial institutions, help them stabilize, reorganize their finances, hopefully reopen and expand. But critics pointed out that while Hoover favored direct aid to business, he's ignoring the individual man. Corporations need money, but what about families in Arkansas that are starving? January, February 1931, 1/3 of Arkansas families are on Red Cross food aid. There's literally 1 out of every 3 families could not feed themselves. One of the richest agricultural states in the country. That's just Arkansas. You have people starving in American cities, famine in the United States. Hoover did nothing except offer to help corporations pay the bills. The situation gets more serious in 1932 with what became called the Bonus March. Summer of 1932, 22,000 unemployed World War I veterans and their families marched to Washington to lobby Congress to pay them immediately. Bonus had been promised to them at the end of World War I. Well, the war was only over for about 14 years at this point. And what happened was, in 1920, as kind of a special thank you to the men who fought in the war, Congress voted to give all these veterans the special savings bond. Basically, free money, they collect it, but the thing is, it's a 25-year bond. It wasn't scheduled to mature until 1945. But 1945, or 1932, the death of the Depression, that might as well be never. They needed money right then. So these veterans here, they're unemployed. They're homeless. They've lost their homes. They couldn't, no money to pay rent or mortgage. They're out on the street. Got nothing else to do. They go to Washington to demand relief. So they call themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. Bonus marchers wanted the money even then, even if it meant they would not receive the full amount, the full bonus bill. Well, the House of Representatives did approve it. Texarkana Congressman named Ralph Patman had pushed through a bill to make sure the veterans would receive their bonuses early, cash in early. But one night as the Senate was voting on it, the bonus marchers had surrounded the Capitol, demanding the Senate approve it. But the Senate rejected it. And instead of walking out to face the bonus marchers whose request they rejected, they leave the Capitol through a secret underground entrance rather than face the people. Well, the bonus marchers decided to stay in Washington until the demands were met, so they organized a ramshackle camp just outside of Washington, an area called Anacostia Flats, Virginia. There's a picture. Yep. Go to page 821 in your book. See the results. Now, these are men with their families, women and children, unarmed, just simply nowhere else to go, simply asking their government to do something to help. Well, in Europe at this point, conditions are so bad. I mean, you've got in Germany in 1932, 40% unemployment. Democratic governments are crumbling across Europe, constrained to the Depression. Veterans are rising up, marching, some of them overthrowing governments, attempting coups against the government. And Hoover's afraid the same thing happening in the United States. So what ends up happening is Hoover orders Army General Douglas MacArthur to keep the peace, but basically keep the situation under control. What's happening is Hoover is ordering the Army to keep an eye on the situation. What happens, though, is MacArthur defies orders, fires on the bonus marchers, and you can see here, attacks these unarmed men, women, and children, and burns their camp to the ground. Hoover is blamed for this crisis. MacArthur is almost thrown out of the Army. Instead, he's basically sent into exile. The furthest, most remote, most miserable post they could think of, command the Army in the Philippines. So you have all this going into the 1932 election. So the country is pointed near collapse. 25% unemployment, 33% unemployment, starvation, mass hunger. Tell you how bad the hunger situation is. In World War II, just a couple of years away, you have all these young men being inducted in the Army. Part of their induction means they have to be examined by doctors. Now, these young men going into the Army and Navy, these are the peak kids who grew up during the Depression. Army doctors are shocked to learn that most of the men being inducted into the military during World War II showed signs they'd suffered malnutrition at some point in their lives. Actually, at some point in their lives, these men who basically saved America from being taken over, being destroyed, are on the edge of starvation at some point in their lives. Your grandparents. So, 32, Democrats nominate Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt is the popular governor of New York. Definitely a reformer like his famous cousin and his idol Theodore Roosevelt was. But Roosevelt's mayor called. He was the Democratic nominee for vice president in 1920. Lost very badly that year, but got even worse that in 1921 he struck down the polio. The polio isn't a disease that even it exists in the United States anymore. It's been cured. Vaccination efforts have basically eradicated polio in the United States and almost every corner of the world. But at this point, in 1921, they didn't have a cure for it, so polio is a disease that basically leaves a lot of people paralyzed. Sometimes to the point it kills them. But Roosevelt was paralyzed from the waist down, so Roosevelt, though, still determined to have a political career, and the attitudes have changed about the handicap today. But in 1921, 1932 even, if you were paralyzed, if you were in a wheelchair, they'd say you were half a man. And if anybody knew Roosevelt couldn't walk, his career was over. What they had to do was they had to stage manage every one of Roosevelt's personal appearances. For example, look here on page 827. See a picture of him standing. This is in newspapers all over the country. You hear him on radio, but of course you can't see him on radio. Actually, he might have the newsreel, the movies. Go to the movie at that time, you get paid 10 cents. He got a double feature, Coke, popcorn, candy. 2 movies. They have middle of it a cartoon and a newsreel. That's basically how you saw the news. It was basically a short 5-minute little presentation, the news of the week on screen. That's the only time you'd ever actually see people, the news like you would on TV. So a lot of times you might see Roosevelt or some other figure sitting behind a desk. Or just for a couple of seconds posing on TV, waving to crowds or talking. But it's going to be just for a few short minutes. But you see here, look very closely at Roosevelt's posture. Very stiff. He's holding on to this podium for dear life. The whole time smiling, waving to crowds. Nothing's wrong. You might see him riding a train, go up to the rail, and he'll be leaning, and you might see him sitting there waving, talking to the crowd, but he'd be leaning on someone. Someone would be holding him up. Had these leg braces to lock his legs in place so he wouldn't slip down. But that's the image people see. Remember, no television in those days. No internet. So everybody sees these brief images. They see Roosevelt standing. They might see him kind of swing his hips around kind of awkwardly. So I saw him walking on the newsreel. Saw him standing in a picture on the newspaper. All stage managed. In fact, there are only a couple photographs in existence of Roosevelt in a wheelchair or with his leg braces. All stage managed. Roosevelt supposedly once told actor Clark Gable, a very popular actor at that time, said, "Clark, you and I are the 2 best actors in the United States." Said nobody ever knew. The media helped them along with this. They decided to give them a break, and they wouldn't take pictures of them in wheelchairs or anything else. In fact, there's a guy who once tried to get a picture of him doing that the other reporter just knocked the camera out of the way. But this is what they had to do at that time. Well, Roosevelt seemed to have it all. He had money, had a winning smile, good sense of humor, and unbreakable confidence that the country would beat the Depression. This is in stark contrast to the dour and frustrated Hoover. Roosevelt's able to cultivate the two wings of the Democratic Party, the traditionalists from the West and the South, with the Northern urbanites, to cobble together an effective coalition that held the Democratic Party together for decades afterward. Party nominated colorful Speaker of the House, John Nance Garner of Texas. Garner started his career at the turn of the century campaigning in South Texas by stagecoach. Once said the vice president it wasn't worth a bucket of warm spit. Most likely he said something else, but the reporters changed it to something else. While vice president, Garner was once asked about a foreign policy issue, some Americans being held captive in Cuba or something. Roosevelt just kind of teased him and said, "Well, what should you do about this?" Said, "I don't care. We need to do this." Said, "Why don't we just go on after them?" Roosevelt said, "Well, people could be killed." Said, "Well, which ones?" Well, Garner, his colorful language, except was an effective politician who helped unify the South and really gather together votes for Roosevelt. Roosevelt, meanwhile, broke with tradition and announced what he called a New Deal for the American people. Well, he's short on specifics, campaign promising to eliminate the federal budget deficit. But his energy in his campaign song, "Happy Days Are Here Again," lifted the spirits of the American people. Hoover renominated. Had a lackluster, uninspired campaign. While Hoover was campaigning across the country by train one day, he received a telegram which stated, "Vote for Roosevelt, make it unanimous." As you can see here on page 828, an overwhelming victory for Roosevelt. He gets 57.4% of the vote, 472 electoral votes. Hoover gets 39.7%, 59 electoral votes. Norman Thomas, the socialist, gets 2.2%. About 881,000 votes. So he just wins a couple of states up in New England, in liberal Republican states called Yankee Republican states. Hoover wins Pennsylvania simply because nobody bothered to show up to vote. The unemployment crisis was too deep. Well, never before, never since, the U.S. has been in such a desperate situation. Poverty, unemployment, desperation of scale never before seen in American history. The conditions that people endured, the Depression, was simply unthinkable, unimaginable. That's how people lived, right on the edge of oblivion. On election night, Roosevelt learned that he was going to be president, he's going to be elected. He told an aide that night, said, "If I get the country through the Depression, I'll be the greatest president ever. If I don't, I'll be the last." Roosevelt took the oath of office on March 4th, 1933. The nation was in a shambles at this point. To prevent more banks from collapsing, banks were closed in 38 states. Governors in New York and Illinois closed banks in Chicago and New York, which basically paralyzed financial transactions across the country. People were scared. 2,300 banks, that is, 2,300 banking corporations had failed in 1932, bringing the total to nearly 6,000 since 1929. Runs on the banks were made by terrified depositors who rescued their savings from failing banks. Because remember, this is right before there was such thing as deposit insurance. If that bank shut down and there was and didn't reopen, you'd lose everything you had in that bank. Your savings, your checking account, all that money you had in it was gone forever. And so people would run to the bank, try to withdraw everything they had as fast as they could before a bank collapsed, so they could save their, rescue their life savings. What was especially problematic was might be a city where there would be a rumor that an otherwise sound bank was about to go under. People would run to that bank as fast as they could and withdraw their money and actually cause that bank to collapse. But as an inaugural address in 1933, Roosevelt assured the nation that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Very famous line repeated often throughout the Depression, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Well, the nation liked the new president. People gathered around the radios religiously to hear Roosevelt deliver what he called his fireside chats. The radio is still fairly new. It was a source of entertainment. And Roosevelt really had mastered radio. He delivered these fireside chats, sounded like just a conversation between old friends. And Roosevelt calmly explained what he was doing to try to combat the Depression. So March 5th, the next day after his inauguration, Roosevelt declared what he called the bank holiday, closing all banks nationwide, and called Congress back into session to pass new banking legislation. So 4 days later, Roosevelt, who had a Democratic House and Senate willing to work with him, passed came to be called the Banking Act of 1933, or simply the Glass-Steagall Act. Here's what the Glass-Steagall Act does. Among other things, creates the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Which insured deposits up to $2,500, which was most deposits in the country at that point. It may not seem like very much, but 1933, that's a lot of money. It was raised to $5,000 in 1934, eventually up to $100,000 for the last half of the 20th century. Today, it's at $250,000. Basically, what happens is, no matter what happens to that bank, your savings are protected. That bank collapses, closes its doors, you still got your money. You still got your life savings. And so on March 12th, Roosevelt addressed the nation by radio explaining the reforms he put in place, which among other things included it bans banks from selling insurance. Can't sell insurance policies. They can't sell stock. You can't allow banks to directly finance corporations. That is, if they have some other business they're part of, that business has to be financed separately. The only money that could come from the bank would be a loan. Essentially, it's created a division in the investment market, try to protect the different sectors of the financial market from collapse. Insurance be separate. Investment banks, it is those selling stocks and so forth, stock brokerage firms, those be separate, and so forth. But the personal finance banks, the ones we typically use, those would all be FDIC insured. If you ever go to a bank, see an FDIC sign on the door, that's what it means. Your deposits are insured. No matter how badly they mess up that bank, your savings are safe. So Roosevelt assured the people that banks are now much safer than burying their money in the backyard or hiding it in a mattress. And now, so the next day, March 13th, the nation's largest, strongest banks would open their doors. And on that day, March 13th, when they did open, customers deposited more money than they withdrew for the first time in years, realizing their deposits are now safe. Now, as I'll explain, some banks would stay closed while the federal government reorganized their finances. But most banks are able to reopen. But what that meant was, to understand how banks work by all the money deposited into them. They take that money, they loan it out to other people. And interest they charge, they split between depositors and the bank to make money. But if no one's depositing anything, that bank doesn't have money to loan out, that bank doesn't have money to operate. So what's happening here is by assuring people their deposits are safe, people are putting money into banks, and banks start taking that money and loaning it out. Loaning it out to somebody wanting to start that business, somebody wanting to buy that car, somebody wanting to buy that house. That corporation that wants that loan to expand the factories, reopen. They now have the money to loan that out, which means the economy can start recovering because the financial industry is now starting to stabilize. So, banking industry stabilized as a result of this. Bank failures effectively ceased for the remainder of the Depression. Only just a couple of banks that failed for the rest of the Depression. The rest of it's saved. Roosevelt's advisors boasted capitalism was saved in 8 days. Instead of nationalizing banks as a complete government takeover, Roosevelt instead threw the resources of the government behind it, preserving private ownership, to adding a safety net guaranteed by the government. And over the next 3 months, Congress passed a dizzying array of legislation to combat the Depression. The 100 Days, as it came to be called, saw the passage of such things as the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Public Works Administration, National Recovery Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And because of that, the first 100 days of any president's new administration has been judged judged in comparison to Roosevelt's. 100 days is a benchmark for any new president now because of what Roosevelt had accomplished. Let's show you some of these different things he passed here. Sheet here, front and back, some of the New Deal programs. Study this closely. We talked about the Banking Act. Agricultural Adjustment Act, aimed at farmers, the AAA as it was called. Have to regulate agricultural production through farm subsidies. First time you'll be getting farm subsidies. Basically stabilizing food production and stabilizing farm prices to keep farmers in business and keep farmers producing by paying them not to produce. Essentially, the biggest problem they had was oversupply. The catch-22, that is, prices going down, so they have to produce more to make ends meet. But the more they produce, the more that increases supply, the more that drove prices down. So by giving farmers subsidies, basically paying them not to produce, it gave them money to tide themselves over, but also kept the commodities prices from collapsing even further. So, coordinated agricultural production during World War II. Certain portions were ruled unconstitutional, but it was reorganized, reworked, and basically, this is the system of farm subsidies that keep America's farms running today. The Civilian Conservation Course is probably one of the most popular of the programs. And involved young men between the ages of 18 and 25, men only. They'd be voluntarily placed in camps to work on regional environmental projects, most of them west of the Mississippi River, but this would be anything from building forestry roads and national forests, tree planting programs, building national parks and national camp and federal campsites at the national parks, so forth, building community parks and so forth, even some forestry projects, building fire watch towers and so forth. All sorts of projects that were needed. What happened is these young men lived at these camps for a while these things were being constructed. They make $30 a month, about $1 a day, of which $25 had to be sent back home. Of course, you're out in the middle of nowhere. $5 is about all you're going to need because they're taking care of food and board and everything. What happened, though, was this worked out really well for a lot of families. It meant one thing, one less mouth to feed at home. Two, $25 coming home every month. Three, these young men getting jobs, getting paid. Four, infrastructure, some of the little things that need to be taken care of by the country are being taken care of. Like I said, when you go even here across Arkansas, you still have a lot of these CCC campgrounds all over the place. One such site in New Jersey during World War II actually became an Army training center, Fort Dix, New Jersey. The others, such as the National Recovery Administration. Roosevelt's attempt to try to jumpstart the economy, called pump priming, is trying to inject cash directly into the economy. Well, the National Recovery Administration attempted to combat the Depression through national economic planning by establishing and administering a system of industrial codes to control production, labor relations, and trade practices. That is basically the government, the corporations, in particular industry, and labor would all be working together, what they call codes of fair competition. It's working together to basically try to help each other pull themselves out of depression. Like I said, they're establishing wage standards, production standards, production quotas for each company, regulations to which each industry would operate. It's cumbersome and it became unpopular very quickly, but what ended up happening is then it banning child labor in some industries, and it ended up establishing minimum wage in some areas for the first time, but it was declared unconstitutional in 1935. But overall, what Roosevelt was doing was trying to keep the economy going, get the economy up and moving. Roosevelt once said to his advisor, if one thing fails, try something else, but above all, try something. This attempt to try something, trying anything, was giving people hope that they would survive to the next day. Not an exaggeration. And because he was trying, Roosevelt was very popular, but overall, there were some signs that the Depression was starting to lift because of the New Deal. We'll talk about more next time.